In 2023, I had the opportunity to attend the Beyond Van Gogh experience. On a stifling hot July afternoon, my friend and I entered a large warehouse, where we breezed past the interpretive panels discussing Vincent Van Gogh's life story, and instead opted to spend most of our time in the main event, the big room where all of his paintings whirled around us. We were overwhelmed with a symphony of color, as Vincent Van Gogh's paintings were splashed high upon the warehouse walls, moving to the sound of classical music being played on indiscernible speakers. I'd seen the beautiful images on social media of other guests walking as shadows through these beautiful images, and there my friend and I were, right there in the thick of it. And I don't know why, but it gave me the ick. At first I thought maybe it was because the paintings only covered the floor and the walls, while the ceiling was left as a large blank void above us. Or perhaps it was the surprisingly low quality of the paintings themselves that looked fine enough on an Instagram story, but were somewhat pixelated and garish in real life. As my friend and I finished our experience, we of course exited through the gift shop, where Van Gogh's paintings were available on any possible surface that we might want to take home with us, on pens and notebook covers and mugs, and you could also purchase a smiling plushie of Vincent Van Gogh himself, complete with missing left ear. I came across a review of the Beyond Van Gogh immersive experience by Rob Horning called Buying Time, and in this article he says, "The relics of art history are ever more available to appropriation and reinvigoration through improving media technology, the point of which is to make art less flat and inaccessible and more consumable and usable, albeit only on commercial terms." If you and I sat down at a coffee shop and I asked you to tell me everything you knew about Vincent Van Gogh, I imagine at minimum you could tell me about how he was an artist who sliced off his own ear. If you really know your stuff, you might tell me about his struggles, both mental and financial, when he was alive, or you might be able to name one of his paintings, or even tell me about his brother Theo. You might tell me about that one episode of Doctor Who that made you weep like a baby, or any number of other movies, books, and documentaries that have been done about him. But why? Why is Vincent Van Gogh everywhere? Why is there an entire Doctor Who episode dedicated to him? Why did the Pokemon Company collaborate with the Van Gogh Museum? Why can't I enter a bookshop without seeing Starry Night garishly splashed across mugs and laptop covers and every other marketable surface? When did Vincent Van Gogh become a commodity? In this video, I want to analyze the commercialization and commodification of not only Vincent Van Gogh's art, but also his life story. In order to properly analyze what is happening here, we need to start at the beginning, because this commercialization process has been cooking for over 130 years at this point, beginning in 1890 when Vincent died. Vincent Willem van Gogh was a Dutch post-impressionist painter who is believed to have only sold a single painting while he was alive. He struggled both mentally and financially and died at the tragically young age of just 37 years old. Vincent had a brother with whom he was very close named Theo, who was also very supportive of his art practice. After Vincent's death, Theo took on all of his paintings and attempted to sell them, in an attempt to try and give his brother some sort of posthumous recognition. But unfortunately, he died not long after Vincent, leaving a widow and an infant son with a home full of unsold paintings. I often see Theo being credited as the one to bring recognition to his brother's paintings, and indeed, he did help him quite extensively while they were both alive, but the driving force behind Vincent's posthumous recognition is Theo's widow, Jo Van Gogh Bonger. 11 years after her brother-in-law's death in 1901, Jo worked with a French poet by the name of Julien Leclerc, and together they held a retrospective exhibition of Vincent's paintings at the Bernheim Jeune Gallery in Paris. A few notable German collectors were present at this exhibition, and they took a very keen interest in Vincent's paintings, opening him up to the German art market, and things kind of snowballed from there, with his paintings finding themselves in collections all across Europe. And this also wasn't the only exhibition that Jo managed to pull off. According to the Van Gogh Museum website, in 1905, Jo pulled off her most significant feat to date, the largest ever retrospective of Vincent's work, held at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. More than 480 artworks were on display. Following this exhibition, the prices of Vincent's work rose rapidly. In 1914, Jo edited and published a number of letters that were sent between Vincent and Theo, and this furthered the public's knowledge of not only Vincent's art, but who he was as a person, and it further humanized and endeared him to people. By the time Jo died in 1925, Vincent's paintings were established as prized pieces of various museum collections, including the National Gallery in London. Jo and Theo's son took over the care of the remaining paintings and had them sent to a foundation, and he would eventually become one of the founding members of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam that opened in 1975. Now, not long after this museum opened in 1975, something happened with the economy in Japan. Why is that relevant? Well, let me tell you. By the end of the 19th century, there was an incredible cultural conversation happening between the West and Japan. Europe became very interested in the art and architecture that was coming out of the newly opened borders of Japan post-1868, and likewise, the Japanese were very interested in Western art and aesthetics. Japanese artists found a connection between Japanese art and Modernist and Post-Impressionist painters like Matisse, Cézanne, Renoir, Van Gogh, where they were interpreted according to a new set of critical terms that drew as much from the artistic ideals that were considered to be traditionally Japanese as from recent European art criticism. As Japanese artists began to explore the paintings in French salons, Japanese collectors began to, collect, with many, including Matsukata Kojiro, amassing a collection consisting of thousands of examples of European art. There was also the creation of the Shirokaba, or the White Birch Society, a monthly magazine published by Japanese artists and writers. The magazine discussed Western aesthetics, art criticisms, and commentaries, and also published texts from artists themselves, including those letters that Jo Van Gogh Bonger shared between her husband Theo and her brother-in-law Vincent. The White Birch Society was also not content to just talk and write about these art pieces either. They also held a number of exhibitions, including one in 1921 that featured the art of Paul Cézanne and Vincent Van Gogh, allowing his art to be put on display to a new, untapped audience in Japan. As I mentioned, Japan's interest in the West was not a one-sided affair. The West was also interested in the art that was coming with those Japanese painters to Paris. According to the letters to his brother, Vincent himself collected hundreds of Japanese prints and incorporated Japanese methods and ways of seeing into his own art. Japan's interest in European art, and especially Van Gogh, would continue to blossom over the 20th century, especially as Jo's dedication to Vincent paid off. By the late 20th century, the Japanese economy was booming, and the wealthy were spending their money on art. And in the 1980s, Japanese art buyers burst onto the scene thanks to a frenzied domestic property market bubble. In March 1987, one of Vincent's iconic sunflower paintings was up for sale at a Christie's auction, and people speculated that the painting would sell for about $12 million. But it didn't sell for $12 million. It didn't sell at even double that, at $24 million. It sold for nearly $40 million, and the buyer was Japanese. The Yasuda Fire and Marine Insurance Company was the one who purchased this painting. This set an auction record and was, at the time, the most expensive painting in the world. But then, in 1989, the record was broken again, when an Australian tycoon by the name of Alan Bond bought a different Van Gogh painting, Irises, for $53.9 million. And guess what? The record was broken again in 1990 by a Japanese paper magnate when he purchased the portrait of Dr. Gachet for $82.5 million. The record for most expensive painting in the world has been repeatedly set and broken, with I believe the current record being held for a purchase price of $117 million. And you guessed it, it's a Van Gogh painting, Orchard with Cypresses, that was purchased anonymously in 2022. I think we can confidently tie the strength of Vincent's legacy to his sister-in-law, Jo. Her work to promote his paintings cannot be understated, but I think the specific interest that Japan had in modernist and post-impressionist art shouldn't be discounted in helping to skyrocket his popularity and recognizability in the Asian art market, allowing Vincent's work to hit a remarkably global stage. His paintings went on display around the world in the 19th and 20th centuries, and in the wake of these exhibitions, people began to covet them. They wanted to purchase them, and because of that, their value has exponentially increased. Owning an original Van Gogh painting is pretty much impossible, but people are still drawn to his work, and they want a piece of it for themselves. While the original paintings of Van Gogh himself are under lock and key in private collections or are being carefully monitored by museum staff at institutions around the world, I would argue that Vincent is perhaps the most accessible artist there has ever been. If you want to look at a piece of his art and you are not located near a museum that has any of it on display, you can pull up the websites or Wikimedia Commons, and there you will find these beautiful high-resolution copies of the paintings, usually accompanied with thoughtful interpretation. If you don't want to do that, there are also films that showcase his story and his struggles. There's TV shows and books that have been written about him. There's also immersive experiences and Pokemon cards and little plushies that you can buy where he's missing an ear. You can find his art on mugs and socks and puzzles and nightlights and shawls and totes, and I want to tell you about Thomas Kinkade.
Hello everyone, I'm Thomas Kinkade. Hello everyone, this is Thomas Kinkade, the painter of light. I'm Thomas Kinkade, the painter of light.
When I started working on this video, I told one of my artist friends how I wanted to talk about the hyper-commercialization of Vincent Van Gogh. And he suggested that I look into this guy called Thomas Kinkade, and I don't think anything could have prepared me for what I would find when I started learning about him. While many artists throughout history have done what they needed to do to get by selling paintings or doing custom work, I don't think anyone has taken it to quite the same heights as this man. You might be familiar with Andy Warhol's Silver Factory of painters, or any number of other artists who commercialize their art. But trust me, they got nothing on Kinkade. Kinkade became extremely wealthy through his art practice, with his net worth estimated to be $66 million at the time of his death in 2012. But today, a few short years later, his paintings are worth practically nothing. If you're not familiar with his work, Kinkade's paintings focus on quaint landscapes, cozy cottages, and the odd scene that showcased his staunch Christian values. Over the course of my research, I saw him referred to as the painter of light, a kitsch master, the most controversial artist of all time, and I saw his art referred to as the McDonald's of painting, with over 10 million satisfied customers. You know, Thomas Kinkade, that guy that got drunk at a Disneyland hotel and pissed on a Winnie the Pooh statue while yelling, "This one's for you, Walt!" If these paintings feel vaguely familiar to you, there are a few reasons for that. For one, his paintings have been used quite extensively to train AI models, so if you see a glowy-looking cottage or a soft, beautiful landscape, there is a very good chance that the AI model used to generate that image was trained off of his stuff. But more relevantly, as I mentioned, Kinkade was very, very good at commercializing his art. Practically every piece of art Kinkade has ever created is very toyetic. It's very merchandisable. It can easily be splashed onto a puzzle or a notebook cover and sold in a gift or stationery shop. While some of Van Gogh's work is much more personal, showcasing his struggles with mental health, such as Self-Portrait with Bandaged Ear or Blue Box Exploding, but much of his portfolio still functions in this very toyetic way. After all, natural images, pretty paintings of landscapes or flowers are generally crowd pleasers that match a variety of aesthetics and make great accessories. If you wanted to put a Kinkade painting on a piece of merchandise, you would need to pay him for the license to use his copyrighted work. While Kinkade made money from the galleries where he sold his paintings, which is its own can of worms that we will come to in a moment, he also had licensing at thousands of retailers where he sold cards, puzzles, mugs, blankets, books, calendars, and nightlights depicting his cozy landscape art. Kinkade received a cut of every single item that was sold in these deals, and he was collaborating with major businesses like La-Z-Boy and Disney. He also had a film made about him, and he also had the village at Hidden Brook, a picturesque Thomas Kinkade gated community in Vallejo, California. Kinkade shook hands and made these deals himself, allowing him to grow his wealth from not only the sales at his galleries, but also from these licensing deals. In comparison, you can purchase a Van Gogh Museum brand license, which, according to their website, is a seal of approval for your product that allows you to stand out from the crowd. Well, you don't really need it to sell your sweatshop Temu Van Gogh merchandise. Not a lawyer, as far as I can tell. No copyright lawyers are going to be hunting you down for putting Starry Night on a shoddily printed wall hanging, because Van Gogh's pieces are in the public domain and are therefore free to use. You can pay the museum for their seal of approval, but as far as I can tell, I think most people just go for the free option. I just want to circle back to Kinkade's actual paintings for a second. Because just to compare, there are 900 paintings and 1,100 drawings and sketches that are confirmed to have been created by Van Gogh. In comparison, many of the articles that I read about Thomas Kinkade purported that during his heyday, 1 in 20 American homes had one of his paintings on display, while others say it was closer to 1 in 10. Even if this figure is hyperbolic in nature, you cannot deny that Kinkade sold thousands upon thousands of his paintings during his lifetime. Well, sort of. If you were to enter an American mall in the 1990s or the 2000s, you might have found yourself in one of the 350 Thomas Kinkade signature galleries. In these galleries, you could purchase reproductions of his paintings. But these weren't just your standard reproductions. Many of them were enhanced by Kinkade himself or someone on his expert team of artists. Now, when I say enhance, I mean that they printed these reproductions onto canvas to give it a more authentic appearance. And whoever was enhancing the image would go through and add paint to highlight certain parts of the paintings, giving it a more dynamic and real appearance.
Now what I'm doing, I'm tapping paint back on a print.
And it would always have an auto pen Kinkade signature in the bottom to give it that authentic vibe. The Thomas Kinkade signature galleries might also host a highlighter event where the customer could sit with the highlighter and watch the process and even make requests. For a little more pink in the rose bushes, say, or a bit more green on the trees. Some highlighters would even let the customers dab some paint on the picture themselves, so it would truly be one of a kind. The people who were purchasing these paintings were generally middle-class, first-time buyers of this quote-unquote original art, and they were led to believe that not only were their paintings one of a kind, but also that they would eventually be an investment.
They're nice investments, and they do have a history of appreciation. We have some secondary market pieces here. This one, Julianne's Cottage, was released for a few $100s in 1992, and now it's $3,730.
By buying an original painting from a Thomas Kinkade gallery, you are not only buying into this idea that you are now an art collector, a prestigious pastime primarily reserved for the ultra-wealthy, but that this was an investment. The few $100s or few grand you dropped onto this painting might balloon into some real money down the road. After all, a Van Gogh painting just sold for millions and millions of dollars. This Kinkade might be the key to your retirement in a few years. Art critics found his art to be kitsch, his technique adequate. They dismissed Kinkade, despite his popularity, as someone whose genius was not for art, but for marketing.
The number one quote critics give me is, "Tom, your work is irrelevant." Now that's fascinating. Fascinating comment. Yes, irrelevant to the little subculture, this microculture of modern art, but here's the point. My art is relevant. because it's relevant to 10 million people. That makes me the most relevant artist in this culture, not the least, because I'm relevant to real people. I remember that quote, man. It was a great quote. It was like, the Louvre is full of dead pictures by dead artists. You know, that's the dead art we don't want anything to do with.
And I'm gonna disagree with you there, Kinkade. A Van Gogh is worth a hell of a lot more money these days than a Kinkade, and I think the reason for that is because he pushed the envelope on the commercialization process too far. Kinkade's originals are worth pennies, partially because of the inauthentic settings in which they were produced. The difference between these two men is that while they both wanted to create art and make revenue from it, the type of marketing techniques that were available to Kinkade in the 1990s and 2000s were definitely not available to Van Gogh over a century earlier. And I'm not trying to say that Van Gogh would have taken this hyper-commercialized route if it was available to him. But Kinkade saw an opportunity and made the choice to adjust the course of his painting career in order to enhance its potential to make money. I believe that the reason why Kinkade's legacy has fallen off is partially because he's not an overly sympathetic figure, but also a repeated critique that I have seen about his art is that while yes, it's pretty to look at, it's very merchandisable, it's very toyetic, it's somewhat soulless. Everyone is, of course, entitled to their own opinion, and everyone interacts with a piece of art differently, but personally, I find his art is somewhat shallow. What you see is what you get. There is no deeper meaning. I've never been moved to tears with the story of how a Kinkade painting was created. They're just cute, pretty paintings that look great on merchandise. There is a life and movement to Van Gogh's art, a personal touch that is hard to miss when you're examining a piece up close. There's an emotional depth, a story to Van Gogh's paintings that you won't find in a Kinkade, and I think that's part of the reason why his legacy is so lackluster in comparison. The fraud, groping, and public urination didn't exactly help his posthumous image, but my point stands. Kinkade is famous, sure. But I highly doubt that most people would be able to name a painting of his on the spot. And in comparison, everyone knows Starry Night. Vincent van Gogh's legacy is a perfect storm for marketing. He is an established, popular artist recognized around the world. He has a compelling life story, his art is remarkable, and it's also in the public domain, so it's free to be used by anybody. While Vincent isn't around to shake hands and make deals in the same way that Kinkade did with Disney and such, the Van Gogh Foundation is doing its best in their namesake's stead. Immersive experiences, special exhibitions, and collaborations with other companies have helped carry Vincent van Gogh's relevancy into the 21st century. In 2023, the Van Gogh Museum and the Pokémon Company launched an official collaboration aimed at introducing new audiences to the work of Vincent van Gogh. This collaboration featured various iconic Van Gogh paintings reimagined with Pokémon, such as Self-Portrait with Grey Felt Hat, but with Pikachu, and my personal favorite, Wheatfield with Crows, but now with Honchcrow and Murkrows. The Pokémon event stated that they wanted to bring Van Gogh's art to new, younger audiences and make it more accessible. But everything I have read about this event makes it sound like utter mayhem, with staff describing it as being like a theme park. It seems like the people who attended the first week of this event were definitely not there for Van Gogh. Instead, they were crawling over one another to get to the merch table where they were selling notebooks, t-shirts, shoulder bags, and of course the limited edition Pikachu with Grey Felt Hat trading card. According to this Guardian article I read where staff were interviewed about this event, it seems like people just breezed past the exhibition itself and went straight for the merch table where scenes like this one emerged. 4 staff were also fired over misconduct surrounding the trading card, and the first week of this event just sounds like a complete mess. Once this specialty card was removed from the shop and the buzz died down around this event, Things did slow down, and it seemed like it finally attracted the crowd it had always intended to, and became the educational experience it was originally designed to be. But as I read about this, again, that ick crept up on me. Since the death of Vincent Van Gogh, someone has been trying to make money off of his art. In the beginning, it was Jo Van Gogh Bonger, who was selling her brother-in-law's art, trying to get him the recognition that she and her husband felt that he deserved. I also imagine that as a widower, she had a financial incentive to want to sell these paintings so that she could make money and, live. But over time, the story and art of Vincent van Gogh has undeniably become a brand. I think that ick comes down to the hyper-consumerism surrounding Vincent van Gogh, who was a remarkably talented artist who also suffered extensively from mental illness and ultimately ended up taking his own life. His life story has been commodified and packaged into a little smiling plush with a missing left ear. I feel like Vincent van Gogh is at risk of disappearing from his own art and life story in the wake of this hyper-consumerism, and I just think that's kind of sad. And to be clear, I don't think he's disappeared entirely from it at this point, because I do think one of the reasons why he's so popular is because of how human he is. I believe that there is an inherent underrated power in stories, and as human beings, we are drawn to them. Most people will struggle with mental illness at some point in their life, and they might find solace in those letters between Vincent and Theo, or in any number of depictions of Vincent in film and television shows and books. Artists who have struggled to make their mark in the art world might find something of a kindred spirit in the history of Vincent van Gogh. His story is bittersweet. His art was never recognized for its beauty while he was alive, but many wonder if perhaps their art will have a similar posthumous recognition. There's also a certain level of class solidarity with Vincent. You are far more likely to be in the same financial straits as him than you do at ever having a chance at owning one of his paintings. I do wonder how Vincent or even Joe or Theo would react to one of those Beyond Van Gogh immersive experiences or the Pokemon collaboration event. I wonder what they would think of the Van Gogh plushies or seeing his art grainily splashed on the high walls of a warehouse. I imagine it wouldn't be the sweeping, beautiful moment we saw in Doctor Who, and instead be a moment of unabashed horror at what has been done to his art. People love Van Gogh to the point where he is considered overrated simply because it feels impossible to get away from him as a consumer. The guy is everywhere. I went to my local art gallery a few weeks ago, which again, I live in Canada, and as far as I know, there has never been an exhibition featuring his art. But sure enough, there was a calendar, coffee mugs, and mints bearing his art or his likeness available for purchase. I found this Tumblr post a while back that discusses how some artists like Van Gogh transcend overratedness and become underrated because they're so normalized, and I have to agree. I thought this was a great post. The point of this video was not to shame anybody for their Van Gogh merch or for attending the Pokemon event, but instead to explore the history of Van Gogh and analyze how his legacy has become the way it has. I have been so lucky to have been able to see a number of original Vincent van Gogh paintings in person. I've been to the Van Gogh Foundation in RLA, and I have to say his work is just stunning. You can just sit there and stare at it and it just moves. There's a color to it. It's got such a unique style. It's just beautiful. Knowing the story of the man behind these pieces makes you feel like you know him, even though you are living centuries apart. I have a piece of homework for you. If you are able, I want you to go to a museum where one of his paintings is on display. That's not possible for most people. So for most people, I want you to find the best quality copy online that you can of one of his paintings. Go to one of the museum websites, pull it up on Wikimedia Commons, and find the biggest screen that you have in your house and make it full screen. And I want you to sit there and I want you to just look at it. Enjoy the painting for what it is. Look at the textures, the shapes, the intended movement of the figures walking through these images. There is no wrong way to consume art, but that doesn't mean that we can't be mindful about how we do it.